Now there was no food in all the land, because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? Our money's gone." And Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I'll give you food for your livestock, since your money's gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock for a year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said, "We will not hide from my Lord that our money is all spent, and our cattle are my Lord's now. There's nothing left for my Lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt and Pharaoh. This is my favorite real estate story in the Bible. Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sowed his field, because the famine was severe upon him. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. So our Bible verse today. Last week, Catherine talked to us about how Joseph's family is dysfunctional. Just like all of our families are a little dysfunctional. And how all of that happened. And it was messy, because families can be messy. But at the end of that story, Joseph was sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites. And we're going to fast forward a bit, so I want to catch you up. The Ishmaelites then sell Joseph in slavery to Egypt, so he becomes a slave in Egypt. But eventually he gets into Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh has some confusing dreams. And Pharaoh doesn't know what to do with these dreams, so he asks the whole kingdom, "Who can interpret my dreams for me?" And Joseph comes forward, and Joseph interprets the dreams correctly. And Pharaoh is really impressed. So Pharaoh gives Joseph his ring, and he dresses him in all his clothes, and he makes him the second most powerful man in the whole kingdom. He's like Pharaoh's prime minister. He's in charge of everybody. And Joseph had predicted there would be 7 years of plenty. So 7 years with lots and lots of good food and lots of good crops. And that happened, and it was great. So Egypt went all their time taking up all the grain they could. They collected as much grain as they could. Because then Joseph predicted there would be 7 years of famine. And the famine showed up, and it was rough. There wasn't food anywhere to be found. People were starving and struggling all over the region, not just in Egypt. And because of the famine, Joseph's family, who thinks he is either dead or in slavery somewhere else, come to Egypt looking to buy food, because they're out of food too. And Joseph is dressed on the throne in his Egyptian clothes and his makeup, and they don't recognize him. And ultimately, Joseph plays some games on him. He tricks them a little bit, but eventually he comes out as their brother. And there's this great family reunion, and it's really awesome when Joseph meets his blood brother and meets his father. And it's a really wonderful scene. And eventually, Joseph asks Pharaoh, and Pharaoh agrees to settle Joseph's family in Goshen, which is in the Nile Delta, which is some really good land. And so they move there, and the family is blessed by Pharaoh. But over time, the famine gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. People use all their money, as you saw, to buy the grain they can. And then a year later, it's still not enough. And people sell all their animals to buy the grain. But it's not enough. And a couple years later, they're stuck again. And finally, they sell all their land, and they even sell themselves into slavery. They sell themselves into slavery to not starve because they're desperate. This is probably not as surprising as it is sad. When you are starving to death, and I imagine especially when you see your children starving to death, you're willing to do anything. You even sell yourself into slavery. So we can't really blame the people here. So the blame then shifts to Joseph, this Old Testament hero of the faith, this leader who we see put in this spot by God. Does this mean God wanted people to starve? No, certainly not. Does this mean God wanted people to be sold into slavery? No, certainly not. No, Joseph worked as the middleman for Pharaoh. In some commentaries I read talked about the fact that Joseph told the people of Egypt they only had to give back 20% of their produce as their tax for being slaves. And they said, that's a pretty good deal. That's not a bad deal for the people that sold themselves into slavery. So this isn't really that big of a deal that they're slaves. But honestly, I think that's kind of dumb. They're trying to rationalize Joseph as hero of the faith. They don't want to make it sound like he did something wrong. Because Joseph was put there, but maybe Joseph was too afraid to ask his boss and wouldn't stand up for starving people. Because it's okay to sell grain for money. And it's also okay to sell grain for livestock. And it's even okay to sell grain for land. But it's sad that it never entered the story for Pharaoh to simply give the grain away. It never entered the story that Pharaoh was the richest man in his world. He was the most powerful man in the world. He had all the money. He had all the livestock. What else did he need? But it wasn't enough. It never entered their mind to just give the grain away. Joseph never thought to ask, to beg, or to fight for these people. Joseph could have stood up for these people, and maybe he did, but I would think it would have been written in the scriptures if he had. But whether for fear or indifference, he chose not to. And Egypt, which was a country of few slaves, turned into an empire of slaves. And we don't know the motivations behind all of this for Joseph. The best way to look at it is Pharaoh made him do it, and he was forced to do it. And that certainly could have happened. But the most uncharitable way to look at it, the hardest way to look at it, is that Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. He was sold as a slave to Egypt. And now as Joseph sits on his throne of power, he enslaves the entire country of Egypt. There's ultimate symmetry there. You can almost see Joseph sitting there, happy with his vengeance upon the country that enslaved him. Gleeful that he got his revenge. The truth is honestly probably somewhere in the middle, but knowing human nature, I feel like the second possibility is maybe a little more likely. Because the truth is, this story is a tragedy. This is not a happy story. This is not a make you feel good and warm inside sort of story. It is tragic that the famine got this bad. And it was supposed to be a blessing that God sent Joseph to interpret these dreams. That God sent Joseph to prepare the country to save up their grain for the coming famine. But Joseph used God's good gift. Instead, he created slavery with it. He created injustice, and he created hell on earth. Joseph was this man who God trusted. And God gave him, and he was given near absolute power. And that absolute power absolutely corrupted him. So why is this in the Bible then? It's certainly not a warm fuzzy. So why is God giving us this tragedy? And why am I preaching on a tragedy? Our usual sermons about Jesus or about parables or about stories in the Bible make us feel good and give us advice to live with. And they're uplifting. So why this? And maybe, I think, it's because this story just is so human. It feels so real. Maybe because this story reminds us a little bit of who we are. Catherine reminded us that the Bible is the story of God's people. It's not a story of perfect people. It's not a story of God's perfect plans, but it's rather a story of God's people living through the world and all the imperfect and messy ways they live, and God trying to make the best of it. In this story, a human story, a story of power and a story of corruption, can feel all too familiar. Because the truth is, I can't always relate to Jesus healing people with miracles, because I haven't seen those in my life. I can't relate to Moses hearing God's voice in the burning bush, because God's never spoken to me through shrubbery. I can't relate to God splitting the Red Sea, because when I go fishing, the lake doesn't suddenly part apart. And there's a lot of things I can't relate to in the Bible. I certainly can't walk on water as often as I've tried in my swimming pool. But stories of corruption, stories of us failing to use the gifts God has given us, well, I think we've all heard about those. I think we've all heard about that a little too much. We hear stories about priests and pastors taking advantage of the children and the people that they're entrusted with. We hear stories about CEOs increasing the prices of life-giving drugs by thousands of dollars to make a profit. We hear stories of politicians taking extra money and taking advantage of their position to get more power. We hear stories about bosses harassing their employees and treating them like dirt just so they can feel better and get more power. We hear stories about employees lying and cheating to get ahead, because all that matters is that you get ahead. And the truth is that again and again and again, we see in our real lives that Joseph's story is not that uncommon, because it's just so human. It's easy to look at the story of Joseph and say, I would never do that. I would never be like Joseph. I would never be like those CEOs, those pastors, those priests that take advantage of people. I would never do that. But is that true? The truth is we don't have the power and the influence of Joseph. None of us are second in charge of the kingdom. And most of us, I don't think, have given the ability to predict prophetic dreams. But if you had, I'd love to hear about it, because I have some weird dreams to tell you. But we still have gifts that God has given us. And far too often, we fail to use those gifts. We fail to use those gifts, and we sometimes even use them at the expense of others. We end up choosing the easy way, and we end up accidentally making hell on earth. We end up falling for the same traps that Joseph did. Because the truth is, I have done this. I have failed to listen, and I have been short-tempered. I have yelled at students when they drive me crazy. Sorry, guys. When some of you may be struggling on your own. I have been rude, and I have overlooked people who needed my help. I have dismissed people, and I have used my authority to get ahead. And I have failed often. Again and again and again, I fail. Maybe you've done the same. And I don't want to admit it, but the sad truth is I see more of myself in the story of Joseph than I want to admit. It's easy to read it quickly and say, that would never happen, but I see myself there more than I want to admit. That joy at vengeance that he had feels familiar. And maybe it does to you, because his story is our story. His mistakes are often our mistakes. But the truth is, we still see God loving Joseph, still using the people of Israel. God doesn't dismiss us when we fail. God doesn't give up on us. God even finds ways to use our failure. And that doesn't mean that God planned for our failures or planned out our mistakes. Rather, it means that God's really good at making lemonade. And thank God he is. The truth is, this is the third to last chapter of Genesis. We're probably next week, we're moving into the book of Exodus. And when we get to Exodus, we find that the entire country of Israel is now enslaved to Pharaoh. And they were not enslaved by Joseph, but rather the bitter irony of this story is that at the beginning of the nationwide enslavement of Egypt, Joseph ended up, by beginning that, he ended up enslaving his own people. Because the fundamental truth that Joseph overlooked is that when you can rationalize enslaving one group of people, you can rationalize enslaving all groups of people. Joseph opened the door for a lot of people to say, oh, it's okay, we've done it that way for a long time. And when we rationalize, we make up a reason in our heads for why some bad behavior or some bad choice is okay. But the truth is, when you rationalize putting one person in slavery, you can rationalize putting any person in slavery. The truth is, when you rationalize taking advantage of one person, you can rationalize taking advantage of anyone. When you rationalize ignoring a person in pain, you can rationalize ignoring any person in pain. And when you rationalize hating someone, you can rationalize hating anyone. Because in little ways and in big ways, we see this rationalization and this hate all around us. We hear the anger and the yelling on TV and on the internet. We see white supremacists chanting things we haven't heard in a long time. We see both sides of the aisle using hate as a reason to hate the other side and get nothing done. We see poverty and pain as we see the marginalized every day ignored. We refuse to see the pain and the suffering around us and around the far reaches of the world to make ourselves feel better. We take advantage when we shouldn't, and we use our power and our influence to get what we want at the expense of others. We don't do these things in big ways, but we often do them in little ways, because we rarely mean to hurt or ignore anyone. But it happens because life is hard and life is complicated. But we do it. And friends, the good news is there is hope. There is always hope. Joseph chose darkness. But we have a hope that never ends, that things can and will be better. Joseph was still walking in darkness. This was before Moses. He did not have the law of Moses, which is the law that gives hope. And we do. We have the Old Testament. Joseph did not know Jesus, did not know his life and teachings, but we do. We have the life and teachings of Christ, and we know and can be better. Joseph walked in darkness, but friends, our hope is that we are called to be light. To be light that shines as bright as our new bulbs in here. Because Jesus says in Matthew, you, friends, are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they set it on a lampstand and it gives light to everyone in the house. Because, friends, we are the light of the world. We are called to be different in our choices, and we are called to be different in our actions. We are to stand against the darkness, and we are to say, we will not ignore pain. No, when we see pain and suffering, we send $5,000 for hurricane relief. Well done. We don't ignore suffering families that don't have a home. We open our homes to them. Well done. We don't ignore students that have moved up here from Houston and don't have school, don't have anything but the clothes on their back. No, we're collecting school supplies. The youth are collecting school supplies for Harvey victims as they try to start a new life here in Dallas and start new school districts. But not just that, we don't ignore the suffering here in Grand Prairie. We give out food to the hungry every month. We offer chances for kids to get new backpacks when they start school. We offer chances for people to buy clothes so they can have their dignity and they can get help. Again and again, we try to do more. But friends, we are never, ever finished. We are the light of the world. We stand against the darkness in large and in small ways. Because that is why the little things we do matter. Not just the big things that we post on the internet, not just the things we brag about, not just the things other people notice, but it's the little things that matter. Sometimes they're the things that matter the most. We may not rule a country, but our small choices matter. The ways we create light and the ways we create light and the ways we create love matter. Because it doesn't matter who sees them, because God sees them. And the truth is, friends, there is still slavery today. Around the world, and unfortunately there is slavery that exists in hidden corners of the United States. And it is our goal to stand out. And unfortunately we can't always fight it because we don't know where it is. And it's a large and powerful force in the world. But we can make little choices that fight it. You may not think this is a big deal, but when you go to the grocery store this week, or next week, or the week after, and when you buy your coffee or when you buy chocolate for your friends or for yourself, those are the choices that you say stand against slavery. Because too often the coffee we drink and the chocolate we eat is built by the hands of child labor in countries where children are working so they don't starve to death. That is not okay, friends. And so there are little, big, and giant ways that you can make a difference just by choosing your coffee. I'm going to post a website later on the Facebook page that might give you advice on where you can do that with. But that's not all. We make choices every single day in the way we treat people, because every person you see has some pain they've dealt with. Maybe the pain's today, and maybe the pain's been weeks ago, years ago, but the pain is still on them. And the way we show compassion, the way we show empathy, the way we show love, is the way we show that we are the light of God, especially when we're annoyed, frustrated, and we want to yell at them. Those are the moments we are most the light of God. You can go home and yell at your small group or your Bible study or your friendship class. You can complain to them. But it's the people that need that the most are often the ones that are the most annoying, the most frustrating, the most discouraging, are the ones that need God's light the most. The way we buy things, the way we treat people, the way we vote, the way we serve. Joseph did so much good and then failed so spectacularly. When he failed big. And this story is a tragedy. God mourned that slavery. God still mourns slavery. God mourned that hatred and that anger and that violence and that pain, and God still mourns hatred, anger, violence, and pain. God mourned the suffering those choices created, and God still mourns the suffering our choices unfortunately make. God mourns when we make mistakes. And we won't be perfect. Thank goodness God doesn't expect us to be. But we are called to be a light to the world. Joseph is a cautionary tale. Don't waste all of the good you do in the life, all of the good choices you make with one gigantic failure. Don't be like my son Joseph, God tells us, but rather be light. We are called to be a light to the world, friends. We are called to shine brightly. And may we go forth this week and shine all the brighter still. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.